So it's 7:05 in Moscow, and I suggest I studying our final lecture for that particular event. My name is Mariana Shkurko. I'm working for Graduate School of Urbanism, High School of Economics, Moscow. And today I'm glad to welcome you to the closing session of our summer lecture series, Housing in Question, organized by my host institution and supported by German organization Dekabristen and also German Federal Office of Foreign Affairs. And during these 2 months, starting in July, we have traveled across different regional contexts. So we had a closer look on what's going on in Germany, Austria, Russia, Czech Republic, in respect to large housing estates. And also we've covered quite a huge amount of different topics related to large housing estates and modernist housing across the Europe. So we talked about the particular types of renovation and questions concerning renovation. We talked about different narratives and discourses that surrounded and have been surrounding this topic since the modernist large housing estates has been established in Europe as a type of morphology and housing. Also covered the question of housing protests and various social effects concerning this particular environment. And today we are coming to our final destination, and we will talk about Northern Europe and what has been going on in Finland. And therefore, I'm really glad to turn the floor over to our today's speaker, Dr. Mats Stjernberg. He's a senior research fellow at the organization called Nordregion, and today he will talk about a bit his Ph.D. thesis that was dedicated to the exploration of the demographic and social processes happening in large housing estates in Finland across the country. So, Mats, please come to us, and yeah, I'm glad to turn the floor over to you.
So first of all, can you hear me?
Yes, that works.
Okay, perfect. And you can see my video as well.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, Mariana, for the good introduction. Yeah, I'm glad to be part of this seminar series. Unfortunately, I have not been able to attend the previous one, but thematically, I had a look at the program, and it seems very interesting. And also, I would believe that my research and my lecture today will be quite nicely in line with the previous lectures that you have had. So yeah, I will talk about post-war housing estates in the Finnish context. I will discuss these types of neighborhoods and how they have evolved over time, and also from a segregation point of view and looking at socio-spatial differentiation in Finland. So just briefly, before I get started, I thought that I would just shortly say a few words about Nordregio, the organization where I currently work, which is Nordregio is a research institute based in Stockholm, Sweden, which was established by the Nordic Council of Ministers some 25 years ago. And Nordregio has a applied research focus, so it's very much about conducting studies about current topical issues and also having a policy relevance, but also a more academic point of view as well. So kind of connecting these both perspectives quite neatly. And Nordregio has a focus on regional development and planning, looking at rural areas, urban areas, and also more governance and policy and so forth. But that was just a brief introduction. I thought that I would just inform you about Nordregio in case you're not aware of us. But you can find more information about Nordregio at our website that you can see on the screen right now. But my lecture today will be based on my Ph.D. dissertation, which I defended last year, called Concrete Suburbia. The research examines suburban housing estates that were constructed in the 60s and 70s in Finland, and also looking at these neighborhoods at a national level, how they have developed over time between 1990 and 2010 specifically. And I've had a particular interest in looking at how these neighborhoods have developed from a socioeconomic and demographic point of view. So yeah, you can find the download link to the dissertation right here as well. So please, if you're interested in reading more, it's available for free download from that website. So I thought that I would structure my lecture somewhat in the following way. I will briefly introduce the Finnish context. We heard in the introduction that you've had previous presentations or lectures about the Czech Republic, Germany, Russia, and so forth, but perhaps the Finnish context is not that familiar to all. So I thought that I would outline that, looking at suburban housing estates, how they, why they were constructed and how they were constructed, and also maybe drawing some parallels to the broader European context. Then after that, we will have a look at how these neighborhoods have developed over time, looking at socioeconomic and demographic statistics to illustrate their long-term development, and then concluding with a discussion. And I think that we will have hopefully some questions popping up from time to time. So I will see, maybe I will answer them as we go on, or otherwise some of them I might be able to address then towards the end of the lecture. So when we're talking about post-war housing estates in Finland, you could say that the post-World War II decades was a time of significant societal change in Finland. And in a Western European context, you can say that Finland stands out a bit because whereas most other Western European countries already had large urban populations in the early 1900s and so forth, Finland actually, in Finland, most of the population still lived in rural areas in the 1950s, and the country was largely an agrarian country up till then. But then in the 60s and 70s, Finland actually, even though Finland witnessed a rather late wave of urbanization was rather rapid, and actually one of the most rapid ones in Europe at that time. And of course, due to this background, there was a need to increase housing production quite substantially to provide adequate housing for the growing urban populations. Of course, something that resembles the situation in many other European countries as well. But in Finland, as in other European countries also, of course, the state started to play a more central role within housing policy. And you can say that from the 1960s onwards, this kind of state-led housing policy, along with the technological advances that allowed to industrialize the construction industry, so the use of prefabricated components and so forth, they were really the drivers that then enabled the construction of post-war housing estates. And the figure that we see here is actually from the early 1950s. So here we see that housing construction in the early 1950s was not yet that reliant on standardization or industrialized housing construction techniques, but it was still more traditional, as you can see in the image. But then from the 1950s onwards, new construction was increasingly steered to more peripheral locations, which meant that more and more housing was built outside of the urban centers. And also the first housing estates were built during that time. These neighborhoods became referred to as metsälähiö. Lähiö is actually the word for housing estate or suburb in Finnish. And the reason why I refer to these neighborhoods as suburban housing estates is that the Finnish term, it has a reference to both the suburban location as well as an implicit reference to a specific kind of built environment. But anyhow, these neighborhoods, these early housing estates, forest suburbs or forest estates, you could call them, such as Tapiola in Espoo, which you can see in the picture right here, they were planned with, you could say, quite close regard to the natural conditions and surroundings. So they were of a rather small scale, and as we will see in the next image, they were still comparatively, they were less dense and compact compared to what would then be constructed during the coming decades. And then in the mid 60s, planning ideals started to change more, and the scale and intensity of building increased. The neighborhood that we see here is called Pihlajamäki. It's located in Helsinki. And many scholars have claimed that this has been a turning point in the way that housing estates were planned and built. And it is kind of marks a transition from these forest estates to what are more referred to as compact estates, which are of a larger scale. And of course, one reason why the intensity and scale of building increased was, of course, that, well, planners, they found that the early estates did not necessarily have a sufficient number of residents to be, for example, services to be able to exist there. And then, of course, also the increased focus on quantity rather than quality, you could say. So the need to construct larger amounts of housing, as during the late 60s and early 70s, urbanization accelerated. And at the same time, housing construction became more industrialized. So this really meant that, as we can see from the image right here, from the Koskela estate in Helsinki, that the designs became maybe a bit more stripped down, and the scale was in many ways larger compared to the early estates from the late 50s or early 60s. And when we look at the current housing stock in Finland, a vast share was actually built during the 1960s and 1970s. And from the mid 60s to the mid 70s, approximately 500,000 dwellings were built in Finland. And maybe Finland is a small country, so it might be difficult to put into context how much that is. But according to Pollock, that was a per capita world record in 1974 when 73,000 new homes were built. Anyhow, this was undoubtedly the peak of housing construction in Finland, and a fourth of all residential buildings in Finland that we currently have were built during this era. And specifically, if we look at multi-story, multi-family homes, a third of all these buildings were built during the 60s and 70s. And so this was, at the same time as this was a period of urbanization, because a lot of people moved from rural areas to cities. On the other hand, it was also, in a way, a kind of suburbanization, because a lot of the people did not actually move to urban areas, but more into suburban neighborhoods. So perhaps compared to some other Western European countries, and particularly compared to neighboring Sweden, for instance, urbanization started later in Finland, and in this way, urbanization maybe took the form of suburbanization. And of course, estimates vary, but approximately it is often said that a fifth of the Finnish population live in post-war housing estates. So that really highlights that this is a rather important housing typology, and also, as we will see in some of the coming slides, that this is a topic which has been highly placed on the policy agenda in Finland, and also something that has interested media and been quite widely discussed in public debates in Finland over the decades. And perhaps these might be notions that have been touched upon in previous lectures as well, because the Finnish history in a way also resembles what can be seen in many other countries as well, in the sense that initially when these neighborhoods were built, they were really symbols of social progress and of modern society, and they were of comparatively high standards, high quality, according to the standards of the time. So for many people who moved into these newly built estates, they moved into modern apartments with running water and something that was not, that in many ways was a considerable upgrade from the standards that had been both in urban areas, but also in rural areas in Finland during the time that preceded. But as in many other European countries as well, the public opinion quite quickly turned against these areas already in the late 70s. And this was also fueled by negative media coverage, which kind of fueled this type of more negative problem-ridden public discourse, you could say. And especially the larger, more massive neighborhoods that were built in the late 70s, they became increasingly associated with various types of problems, both related to the physical conditions of the neighborhoods as well as to the social qualities of the estates. And as a response, you could say that the focus, the construction of housing estates ended quite quickly in the late 70s due to this critique, and then the focus shifted quite soon to refurbishment and regeneration of these types of neighborhoods. And actually the first renewal projects targeting suburban housing estates were already launched in the late 1970s. So in some cases, less than 10 years before the neighborhoods were built. And then, but even more so during the 1990s, in the aftermath of Finland was severely affected by an economic recession in the early 1990s. And after that, there were increased public concerns about these types of neighborhoods, and specifically about increasing unemployment and fears about more social problems and so forth related to this. So there was an increasing policy focus on revitalizing these neighborhoods, and the first more comprehensive national suburban housing estate renewal program was launched in the mid-1990s. And since then, there have been 6 national programs for the housing estate renewal, which basically function in the way that the state provides funding, and then municipalities can apply for this funding and then carry out different types of regeneration projects. And the most recent one was actually launched in 2020. So this really highlights that these types of neighborhoods are highly placed on the policy agenda in Finland, and have been so already for a few decades, you could say. So for the ones of you who do not read Finnish, these are just illustrations of what types of media portrayal, or how the media often portrays these types of neighborhoods in the newspapers and so forth. Will help you a bit if you're struggling with your Finnish reading. Basically, you could say here that the public debate in Finland concerning these types of neighborhoods basically either revolves around concerns about segregation or the unfavorable development of these types of neighborhoods, and fears about concentration of social problems, and so forth. And then on the other hand, also the need for physical redevelopment, because when these neighborhoods were built some approximately 50 years ago, they are now approaching, in many cases, their kind of like the end of their technical lifespan, or at least in the sense that they will need to undergo quite massive reconstruction to be upgraded and modernized. So these are really two key issues that are quite prominent in the public and policy debate in Finland when we're talking about post-war housing estates. I would say that this maybe resonates with the situation in many other European countries as well, where post-war housing estates in many cases are increasingly associated with physical, social, and economic decline. But okay, so then following this introduction into why these neighborhoods were built and how they then developed soon after their construction, I thought that we would have a look at certain socioeconomic and demographic changes and how these neighborhoods really have developed over time, looking at the situation following the year 1990. So my PhD thesis actually is it focuses on roughly 600 housing estates in the whole of Finland. All of these neighborhoods were built in the 60s and 70s. So, and they are located outside of the urban centers, and they have been identified and classified according to various sets of GIS data. So these are, which you can read more about from my dissertation if you're interested, but basically these are neighborhoods that share resemblance in terms of their physical environments and housing stock, and also location in the sense that they're located outside of the immediate urban centers. But as you can see from the map, housing estate construction was really something that took place in the whole of Finland, and these types of neighborhoods can be found throughout the country. Even though the vast majority are located in the larger cities, it is worth recognizing that these types of neighborhoods can basically be found in pretty much every medium-sized or even small Finnish town. So looking at in these graphs, I will show just how a typical Finnish housing estate has evolved over time. The values that you can see here are median values, which really illustrate how an average Finnish housing estate was, what the position was in 1990 compared to 2010. So first of all, if we look at the number of residents, we can see that there has been a rather substantial decrease in population. So an average housing estate, in my research data, in 1990, this neighborhood had 605 inhabitants, but 20 years later, this had decreased to 502. So this approximately 20% change is quite substantial, and something that, and at the same time, if we look at the number of households, this has remained rather constant. And the explanation for this is, of course, something that is connected to changes in the household composition. Population aging is one of the major developments that we can see in Finnish post-war housing estates. And specifically, if we look at the share of people aged 65 and older, in 1990, that was around 11.7%, but this increased to over 20% 20 years later. So this really illustrates that the household composition has shifted rather significantly. And also in parallel with this, the share of single person households has increased quite noticeably. And when we look at these neighborhoods, in many cases, over 50% of the households are single person households. They're not, and usually elderly single person households. So this, of course, is something that explains why the number of people has decreased, because there are more and more people who live alone, basically in the same housing stock. Something that in the Finnish context, immigration, which has been one of the main drivers of demographic change in post-war housing estates in many Western European countries, is something that has not been that noticeable in Finland, due to the fact that Finland has traditionally been a country from where people have emigrated to Sweden and many other countries as well. But and immigration in Finland, or international migration, which to Finland has actually only started during the 2000s, you could say. And in many cases, even though there is a somewhat noticeable increase in the share of people with a foreign first language, this change has not really been that noticeable in comparison to many other European countries, and compared to Sweden, for example. Of course, something that has been, in addition to these demographic changes, socioeconomic changes are also highly noticeable in the Finnish housing estates. Particularly, an increase in unemployment has been very noticeable. In 1990, most housing estates had a only slightly higher unemployment rate compared to Finland overall. The unemployment rate in a typical Finnish housing estate in 1990 was 6.7%, but then in 2010, this had increased to over 16%. And this, the most noticeable increase occurred in the aftermath of I mentioned earlier that Finland underwent a rather deep economic recession in the early 1990s, and this has been followed by structural unemployment in many housing estates, which I will dive into a bit deeper in just a minute. In addition, we see here that also there has been an unfavorable development of income as well. There are more low-income households and fewer high-income households. Of course, something that is logically in line with increases in unemployment. And what is also noticeable is that the population in these types of neighborhoods generally have a rather low educational level. So even though the educational level has increased from 1990 to 2010, we see that compared to the country at large, this increase has been less. So in relative terms, the population in these neighborhoods, they have a lower education, which of course is something that we can then connect to the higher unemployment and to structural labor market changes, where many of the people who have lived in these neighborhoods have then had more difficulties finding employment during the last couple of decades. So what I just showed you were just illustrations of how an average housing estate in Finland looks like and how the position has changed. But actually, when we're talking about 600 different neighborhoods, it is evident that the differences between these neighborhoods are quite substantial, and also depending on where in Finland they are located, in what types of regional contexts, there are quite noticeable differences, as I will show you in just a second. So here, I'm going to show you how firstly, how the unemployment rate has changed in housing estates that are located in growing regions. So these are, for example, the Helsinki capital region and also the other major urban regions like Tampere, Turku, Oulu, and so forth. How unemployment has developed in these post-war housing estates compared to the region overall. So in the graph here, we see each dot represents a housing estate, and the dots that are located above the red line are ones where the unemployment rate is higher than in the region overall. And we see here that there are some housing estates that had a higher unemployment rate, but many of them are also located below the line, which really shows that in 1990 that there were many housing estates that had a lower unemployment rate than the region overall. But then when we look at the situation 20 years later, we see that a rather substantial change has occurred. And even though there are some housing estates that still have relatively low unemployment rates, that the majority of the estates have really seen a rather noticeable increase in unemployment. And for example, in 1990, not a single housing estate had an unemployment rate over 20%, but in 2010, there were numerous housing estates where the unemployment rate was higher than 20 or even 30%. And then below, we look at housing estates that are located in shrinking regions. So these are regions that have lost population, for example, due to deindustrialization. And these are, in many cases, housing estates in these types of regions were built to accommodate the needs of people working in the local industries. But then after economic restructuring and other developments, there has been a rather significant increase in unemployment in these regions, and this is specifically visible in many post-war housing estates. So we see here that the housing estates in shrinking regions have actually seen an even more significant increase in unemployment than the ones that are located in the larger urban regions that are witnessing population increase. Without going into these with too much detail, we see a similar development when looking at the share of low-income households in these neighborhoods. And again, that really shrinking estates and shrinking regions have developed the least favorably, you could say. Also, this shows the share of seniors, people that are aged 65 and older in housing estates compared to the regional average in growing and in shrinking regions. And again, we see a rather noticeable difference here that population aging is much more pronounced in housing estates that are located in these shrinking regions that are losing population. And of course, this is in line with the general development, because in these shrinking regions, the population structure more broadly is much older, and also young people have migrated away from these regions, so they are both shrinking and undergoing quite noticeable population aging, and this is reflected particularly noticeably in these housing estates. One final example is that, then looking at immigration, how this has affected these neighborhoods. Here we see a different pattern in the sense that the most noticeable increase in people with a foreign mother tongue is in housing estates that are located in the larger urban growing regions, whereas immigration has not been an important driver of demographic change in these shrinking regions. So this was just to illustrate that when we're talking about post-war housing estates in Finland, there are quite noticeable differences depending on where in the country they are located. And then I thought that as really socioeconomic change and socioeconomic decline, if you will, has been perhaps the most noticeable change in these neighborhoods during the last few decades, and particularly unemployment. Here, I will also show that looking at housing estates that are located in the same city. So, for example, here we have the city of Helsinki, 32 different housing estates, and each of these estates are represented by a line, and the blue lines are ones where the employment rate is higher than in the city average. The red ones have a lower employment rate. So here we see really a rather differentiated development, in the sense that in 1990, these neighborhoods, the differences between the different estates was rather minimal. Only the employment rate differed with a few percentage points. So this was in many ways not noticeable in any way. But then when we look at the development during the coming 2 decades, we see that really the neighborhoods have followed rather different types of development trajectories. And then also when we look at the situation in other Finnish cities, we see the same dynamic. And really, yeah, when we look at the development trajectories of these neighborhoods, it is evident that they are not a homogeneous group of areas that have followed similar lines of development. Okay, so then moving into the final part, I thought that just trying to maybe synthesize or condense what we can observe when we look at the long-term development of these neighborhoods over time, it's quite clear that even though these neighborhoods have had a rather negative reputation in Finland almost since they were constructed, or at least since the 1970s, that they were still relatively average neighborhoods in 1990 before the economic recession, both in terms of their socioeconomic and demographic structure. So in many ways, even though the neighborhoods had a rather negative reputation, this was in a way unwarranted, because the neighborhoods did not really significantly differ from other types of urban or suburban neighborhoods. But as we can see from the previous slides and the illustrations there, we see that the general development clearly shows that many of these neighborhoods, most of them actually have undergone a rather noticeable socioeconomic decline in parallel with various demographic changes that have occurred. And really this differentiated development is rather noticeable. So the neighborhoods were much more similar in 1990, which really reflects the general situation that inequality was lower in Finland, and for example, income inequality, but also unemployment rates were significantly lower at that time, and cities were much less segregated at that time. So following the recession of the early 1990s, there has been a clear tendency towards increased differentiation. And in a long-term perspective, you could say that it seems that the attractiveness of these neighborhoods has gradually decreased. And maybe this has to do with the fact that many other urban neighborhoods have become more sought after later. And perhaps there are tendencies that these neighborhoods maybe correspond less well to the preferences of people who look for either urban or suburban living. And then, of course, it's quite clear that the development of these housing estates, or any neighborhood in general, is, of course, clearly connected to broader societal developments and changes, and particularly to the development of their wider regions. So we really see a clear difference in the trajectories of housing estates in larger, growing regions compared to shrinking regions. And then I'd like to also emphasize this point again, that I think that when we're talking about housing estates in Europe, or in any European country, or even in any city, it's clear that these neighborhoods, even though we can, categorize them in a similar way, or group them into label them as housing estates, or modernist housing estates, large housing estates, post-war housing estates, what label we want to use, that they are not a homogeneous group of areas, and not all of these neighborhoods are disadvantaged. And even in the same city, neighborhoods that are located nearby, they can be rather different, and in some cases have followed very different lines of developments. And of course, when we're kind of thinking about what factors are driving these changes, or have contributed to these changes that we have seen, of course, the importance of it's evident that structural economic and labor market changes in Finland have been very central, and in many cases, they really clearly show that this is what explains the increase in high unemployment, and also the fact that the population in these neighborhoods has had a comparatively low educational level, is something that are closely connected. We see here that, let me see. Oh yeah, some small technical difficulties, but I think that it should be okay right now. Okay, so of course, one important notion is that really the employment prospects of people with lower education have really decreased in Finland during the last few decades, and I think that this is something that goes for most countries in Europe. And for example, in Finland, the number of jobs that were held by people who only had basic level education decreased from 875,000 to 260,000 between 1987 and 2015. So this really shows that this structural change has been rather profound. And as a result, there are more and more people who have been left outside the labor market. And of course, this demographic change, and particularly population aging, is something that we see very clearly in the Finnish housing estates, in many cases much more than in, for example, Sweden. We see that, initially these neighborhoods were built for families with children, and this is the typical household group that moved into these neighborhoods when they were built, but now they are increasingly populated by older people, single person households. And this, of course, is then manifested in population decrease, which in turn, in many cases, has resulted in a significant decrease in the level of services and amenities. So, of course, these types of factors really feed into each other. And of course, there is not one single component that has driven this change, but rather a collection of different types of local and more general developments that have affected how these neighborhoods have evolved over time. And of course, as I showed you, the importance of immigration has thus far been rather low in most Finnish housing estates, especially compared to, for example, Sweden, in Stockholm, Gothenburg, Malmö. You can find housing estates where the population to more than 80% of the population is has a foreign background. So in Finland, the context is very different compared to this. But of course, when looking at the more recent developments, this is likely to change. And immigration is increasing and will most likely be a more important driver of change in the decades to come, also in Finland. And then, of course, one more general reflection comparing to how the position of these neighborhoods has changed over time in a more long-term perspective. It seems that these neighborhoods now when they were built, they were of high quality according to the standards of the time, but now they perhaps they do not anymore correspond to the housing preferences and needs of most. And this type of downward filtering of these neighborhoods is evident, and in many cases, the lowest housing prices, real estate prices are found in these neighborhoods, and of course also due to relatively high shares of social housing in these neighborhoods. They offer affordable housing, but have become less attractive, particularly for middle class families, and this has been a rather noticeable change when looking at the situation a few decades back. And then, of course, in addition to these more general developments, it is clear that, I mean, when we look at these neighborhoods that share many similarities, there are still substantial differences. So really, these more local conditions and estate-specific factors are also very important when we look at how these neighborhoods have developed and so forth. For example, the geographical location of the neighborhood is very important. More peripheral estates that are weaker connected to the surrounding city, in terms of public transport, for instance, are generally have a lower socioeconomic ranking, but also tenure structure and generally the housing stock of the neighborhoods is an important factor as well. Most of the neighborhoods, in my PhD, I've actually also looked at housing tenure, which was not now included that explicitly in the slides, but it is clear that the most disadvantaged neighborhoods are in fact neighborhoods that have proportionately high shares of social housing. And of course, the reputation of an estate, many of these neighborhoods have a rather negative image and are connected to different types of social problems and viewed in a problematic way. So this is, of course, something that will negatively affect the development of these neighborhoods, especially as we know that when a neighborhood becomes stigmatized, it can take rather long to get rid of that stigma. But you could say that a collection of different general but also more local developments together then influence the trajectories of these neighborhoods and how they develop over time. So just to conclude, I thought that I would try to round up with a few thoughts about how these Finnish estates, how they compare to estates in a wider European context. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, it seems that the motives for constructing these neighborhoods were rather similar in many European countries. They were built in many cases to improve housing standards as a result of governments taking more central roles in housing policy, but also there was similar planning ideas influenced planning in Finland as well as in other parts of Europe, and then similar types of construction techniques. So this is something that really also explains that they do, in many cases, it's difficult to tell if a post-war housing estate is located in Finland or in Sweden or in Germany. There are, of course, local nuances that differ, but there are clear similarities in terms of the physical structure of these neighborhoods and how they were built and planned. And of course, the long-term development that we've looked at here is in many ways rather similar to post-war housing estates in many Western European countries, where they have increasingly become connected to economic, physical, and social decline, and where this already occurred rather soon after these neighborhoods were constructed. And of course, the change here that we can see also is that they were built for working class families, in some cases even middle class families in Finland. But now, following these changes, they have become less sought after, especially for middle class families and households, but also which is something that can be seen in the significant aging of the population structure, and especially in the regions in Finland where population is decreasing, that there really is the neighborhoods are predominantly older single people aged 65 and older. And this development is intensifying all the time when we look at population projections. So this is of course a rather challenging equation. Good. And then just a few thoughts about what differs. As I mentioned already previously, that in Finland, these neighborhoods, even though they became quite stigmatized and gained a negative reputation already in the late 70s, these neighborhoods were still relatively average compared to other types of urban and suburban neighborhoods in 1990. Whereas in many other parts of Western Europe, post-war housing estates fell into decline already much earlier than this. And as I already touched upon, especially now for me, working and living in Sweden, the clear difference between Finland and Sweden, but also other countries, is really that thus far, immigration has not been a very important demographic driver of change yet, but of course this will likely become more important in the years to come. But overall, I think that this underlines that context matters, and even though we're talking about post-war housing estates that share a common history and have many similarities, that they are actually a rather diverse group of areas that have followed different lines of development. So it is very welcome that for example, this seminar series is organized so that we gain more awareness about these neighborhoods and how we can learn from each other. Okay, thank you. That was all for now. I see that I have a couple of questions here. Okay, so there's one question about okay, about the data. So actually, this is not open. There was a question if the unemployment data is open data. No, this was actually a significant part of my PhD research was about harmonizing and collecting the data. Of course, there is, I mean, even the because there is not a ready-made data set that can be used for this for studying housing estates in the way that I have. So that's why this data has been kind of collected from detailed grid level data and then aggregated to the housing estate level. So, but you can read more about that if you're interested in the dissertation. Have you seen illegal buildings with increased unemployment and migration? What are the policies implemented by the government on this issue, if there is? Actually, I think in the Finnish context, not that I am aware of, increased. I'm not actually sure about this question. Not to my knowledge, are there examples of this? But then you have a question about, have there been attempts to revitalize these unattractive structures? Indeed, there have. And as I mentioned, these types of neighborhoods have been targeted by different types of regeneration initiatives in some cases since the 1970s, but more commonly since the 1990s. So there have been different types of initiatives focusing on upgrading the physical environments of the neighborhoods, but also more projects with a stronger focus on, strengthening social cohesion and counteracting the negative effects of structural unemployment, for example. So this is something that is highly placed on the policy agenda. And in 2020, the Finnish government launched a new national program for the renewal of housing estates. So this is something that is currently also constantly on the agenda. But of course, maybe what is challenging and problematic is that a lot of, for example, the very often structural unemployment and segregation are the issues that these projects aim to address, but it's very difficult to tackle or deal with these issues at a local neighborhood level. Yeah. Then there are some others. Are there any specific national or local large housing estates in shrinking cities? I think that actually, as I mentioned, the current national government housing estate renewal program, the focus there is on the larger cities. So actually the shrinking cities are left out of this equation. But I would say that there are some policies where the focus is more specifically on these shrinking regions. And of course, one challenge is that in addition to the changes that I just highlighted in my lecture, there is an increasing number of vacant apartments. So then in some municipalities in Finland, the municipalities have actually decided to, because there is an oversupply of social housing, for example. So there have been some cases where housing has been demolished. But this, compared to some other European countries, housing demolition is something that has only actually been taken up quite recently in Finland. So I think that, but if we look at the development trajectories and especially the fact that many of these estates are located in regions and cities where the population is shrinking, that the question of demolition is something that really might become more widespread. Yes. Okay. There's one more question that I think that I will try to answer. Which of with new challenges better, those try to preserve? I think that your question was about which housing estates have coped better with the new challenges, those that have tried to preserve the previous socioeconomic situation, or those that have faced the most significant transformation. I think that difficult to say for sure, but my impression is that the housing estates that have managed to cope the best are ones where, I mean, what is positive about the fact that many of these neighborhoods have like I mentioned, they have there's a noticeable increase in people in the older age groups. So at least in these cases, there is perhaps a situation where many of the residents have lived in the neighborhoods for a longer time. So they do have a stronger attachment to the neighborhood, and there might be a stronger, better preconditions of really developing the neighborhoods, whereas compared to some other neighborhoods where there is a large turnover of residents and people only stay there for very short times. I think that the conditions for strengthening social cohesion and whatnot is rather challenging, I would say. Okay, if I'm not mistaken, I think I answered pretty much all of the questions. So.
I think there is one more left
Okay.
at the upper side. So Tamara is asking, what are the most important political changes happened since 1990s, influencing the social housing structure and its dynamic?
I would say that, I mean, the most important political changes now there is combating segregation has really emerged on the policy agenda in Finland quite noticeably. And the difference, for example, in the city of Helsinki, unemployment rates, even in the most distressed neighborhoods, was around 2 or 3% in 1990. And now there are some neighborhoods where this has increased to like 25%. So I think that really this is a key issue. And of course, I mean, that can't necessarily be answered in a short way, but I think that how we counteract segregation and develop more inclusive cities is a huge challenge. But I think that these are two aspects that have emerged more and more on the policy agenda in Finland. And the recent government program that was launched for funding projects that regenerate these housing estates, it has a very strong focus on this, on preventing segregation before it becomes extremely pronounced. So I would say that comparing to Swedish cities, for example, Finland the Finnish cities are less segregated. And I think that in Finland there is a notion of learning from the mistakes of others and preventing segregation before it emerges. But as we can see, there are already quite significant differences when comparing different neighborhoods.
So am I right when we are talking about segregation in all those areas, it is more likely to be like age and income-based segregation, or are there any other foundations for that?
Yeah, actually, ethnic segregation, as we see, it's not yet like the most prominent one, but I think that yes, it's mostly based on socioeconomic, specifically like low income, high unemployment, and then this age segregation as well. That's something that, and then in the shrinking regions, these two go very closely hand in hand. So the estates in these shrinking former manufacturing cities, there we have a situation where the unemployment rate might be 35%, and the share of people who are pensioners is 40%. So then this is quite a significant change when comparing to the fact that when they were built for like working families, but now the majority of the population in these neighborhoods are not actually employed. So I think that this has been a rather significant structural change that has occurred.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And I also have one probably more question about the like the spreading of different types of housing estates around Finland, and like those like spatial disbalances in the on the countries on like a national scale. So when we talk about like housing crisis, which is what topic is quite well, what issue is quite topical for like European cities. So when we are talking about a particular crisis, sometimes we tend to think that the problem is not that housing is not provided on the like the substantial level, but however there is housing stock where it is not like needed and where there is no like more social demand from the citizens. But however, in the growing region or in like capital cities, like this demand is relatively higher in comparison to the other district or to the other regions of the country. So when we come and that's why sometimes we can see that in European cities there is another narrative emerging that large housing estates are, and especially like those modernist large housing estates, are the housing stock that that takes quite an amount into the proportion of various housing stocks around the country. So those particular housing can be a source in order to fill in the gaps and a possible answer for that housing crisis.
Yeah.
So is this also relatable to the Finnish context, or like the situation differs a little bit?
I would say that, yeah, it's a very good point. And I see a clear, I see parallels, absolutely. I think that it is in the neighborhoods or in the cities, in the growing cities, these neighborhoods have a different function because due to the high demand for housing, there is even the situation that there is in these growing regions, there is a shortage of housing, whereas in the shrinking regions, there's an oversupply of housing. So I think that this does already, by definition, in that sense, these neighborhoods have completely different roles. And also in terms of, like we can see for example, in Helsinki, that some of the neighborhoods, some of the housing estates that formerly have had a rather negative reputation, they have now become more sought after because with, increasing housing prices, not, all middle class families can afford to live in the urban areas. So then maybe it's too extreme to say that there are gentrifying housing estates, but there are tendencies that, especially from the earlier 60s housing estates that, still have some kind of like architectural qualities, perhaps compared to the later, more massive ones. I think especially those are ones where housing prices are going up right now, and you can see that there are now the perception, regarding these areas is changing. But I think that's a very, very good point. Really, this question of the regional housing market, and but then the problem. So when looking into the future, I think that the most challenging situation is really for the housing estates that are located in these shrinking regions, because they're even maintaining the buildings and the housing companies. It's a very difficult economic equation when you have vacant apartments, and especially in a situation where there would be need to physically renew the neighborhoods. So then that's why I think that the question of demolition in some of these areas is becoming more. It's becoming something that is more used more frequently in the toolbox of planners. Yeah.
Yeah. So, any more questions that we want to address today? So maybe just one little more from my
Yeah.
side, because you've mentioned that you've also made an analysis of the tenure structure of those housing estates. And for instance, when we look at the situation in Russian cities, especially in the light of the recent renovation program in Moscow, and then in St. Petersburg, like the renovation program of 2008, most of the households and they own the apartments that they live in. So basically, that percentage of the house of the social housing is quite low, and that's why. But still, there is, and sometimes there is what is called like the institutional trap. So when people want to, they form the association of dwellers, and they want to manage their housing. So sometimes owners and renters, they cannot find like the common ground in order to manage those housing. But also, we have seen that during the renovation programs, like those, like the number of privately owned housing units is not quite a problem for the government to still renovate those buildings, and not asking for the consent from the dwellers. So when we come to the Finnish situation, can we say that like most of those large housing estates are like the owners owned, or like the renters owned? So what are the balances, and also if there is, so how, maybe you can highlight a bit more about how the about like those correlations between the renovation program and the citizens' response to it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, but a good question. It varies very much from city to city. Actually, in the city of Helsinki, there has been a policy of social mixing already since the 1960s. So that means that there are no housing estates that entirely consist of rented social housing. So the planning of the neighborhoods already from the 60s until the current date, the policy is that you should mix, or they mix different tenure forms. But then in other Finnish cities, for example, in the city of Turku, which is the third or fourth largest city in Finland, I think, there they have not, had a similar type of social mixing policy. So there are neighborhoods that pretty much entirely consist of social rented housing, or at least the overwhelming share. And I think that in terms of like renovating, now, even though traditionally social rented housing has perhaps been the most stigmatized, or the one with the lowest status, I think that now in some cities there is a tendency that from the municipality's perspective, it's much easier to deal with the social rented housing stock, because then they are able to, carry out these renovations. Whereas in some of the privately owned housing units, it might also be, especially in shrinking regions where the value of the housing units is so low that renovations would be more expensive. For there, it's from the household's perspective, they will not be, they will try to avoid renovating for as long as possible, because they will not afford it. So yeah, I'm not sure if I entirely answered your question, but yeah, that's
more or less, because sometimes we also meet those opinions that because social housing is allocated to the responsibility of the government, or to the municipality or regional government or whatsoever, in some cases it might be much well managed,
yes.
and much well controlled, rather than owner occupied. So that's why when, for instance, we look at the renovation program in France, and we talk about like those city center renovation programs, like the responsible bodies of the government, they say that sometimes like own or occupy apartment in they are in a worse condition than those managed by the local authorities.
Yeah.
So because also because of some of the like those socioeconomical challenges.
Yeah.
So for instance, when all of the like fiscal responsibilities are on people which are like low income or for instance elderly people or whatsoever, so they
Yeah.
have more struggles in managing and like
Yeah.
the housing that's in some other cases.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so basically that was like the origin of my thoughts
Yeah.
over
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. There's actually, I think that there is, I mean, when we look at socioeconomic, characteristics, then social housing, people who live in social housing have a lower rank in Finland and in different parts of the country. But I think that what you mentioned about I think that this is something that there is no research about that in Finland about whether privately owned housing, because there are quite a lot of the rental housing units in these housing estates are privately owned, and I haven't really seen any research on it, but I have discussed this with some planners, and I think that there is a tendency that in some cases that there are more and more neighborhoods where actually the estates that have high shares of privately owned rental housing, that they are, not as well kept and maintained as the social housing. So I think that there might be something like that in Finland, but I haven't really looked at that myself, and to my knowledge, that this has not really been researched in the Finnish context, but a very, very interesting perspective for sure.
Yeah, okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I don't see any more questions in our chat section, so I think that at this point, we shall wrap it up. And
Yeah. Okay, well, it was my pleasure. It was fun to be part of this, and thank you for all the questions, and to everyone who listened. Oh yeah, so have a good day to everyone.
So thank you very much for coming and sharing your perspective, data, and everything that and your experience on the large housing estates in Finland. And thank you very much for all of the participants for the questions, attention, and reactions via fire button that I've recently seen, that I'm at the moment seeing on my screen. So thank you very much, and I hope that this particular lecture and the lecture series in general was a pleasure for you to visit, and you had an opportunity to learn something new and to broaden your research and study perspective on that particular environment and on that particular housing. So I will be glad to welcome you to the further events of Graduate School of Economics, and also wish you a very nice evening and the rest of the week. So see you then.
See you then.
And all have a good evening. Yeah.
Okay, you too.
Let's
keep
in touch.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.